You are back on K-Talk Radio, AM 630, k-talk.com, with the Liberty Lineup, the naked truth, where we think right and wrong, not right and left. This is Ben McClintock with Ben McClintock. Join our grassroots network and get our updates and alerts and support the cause of liberty at libertylineup.com. That's libertylineup.com. You can also like and share our Facebook page, the Liberty Lineup Radio Show. And we are getting ready to talk with Dr. Angus McIntosh, who is the adjunct professor at Texas A&M University, and he is also a former Forest Service employee, and he has been given presentations. He was the one that was speaking right before in Cedar City, right before the death or the murder, the assassination of Lavoy Finicum up in Oregon. But Dr. McIntosh was speaking down in Cedar City, discussing helping people, the ranchers, understand their rights and so that they could act accordingly. Dr. McIntosh, thanks for joining us today. Oops, there you are. Are you there? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, we got you. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me on.
So give us a brief synopsis. You gave several different accounts there that I thought were really interesting about your background with the Forest Service and how you came to understand what was really going on with the ranchers.
Well, when I was first started working for the Forest Service about 26 years ago, it was a big issue even then. Property rights issues have been running kind of hot and cold for the last 100 years. And it seems like sometimes things are worse with some administrations than they are with the others. We actually did a study when I was at New Mexico State University, and what we found was that typically when a conservative or generally Republican administration comes in, for example, Ronald Reagan during his time period, he was a Western governor, he understood the issues. Things kind of smooth out a little bit and kind of plateau, and then when we would get more socialist-minded type administration come in, and we tracked it and did the research based on numbers of livestock numbers in national forests in New Mexico, based on whether it was a Republican or a Democrat administration. And under a Democrat administration, there was always a reduction in livestock numbers. Unfortunately, when a Republican administration came in, it just kind of plateaued out. So the numbers never recovered. So it's been a continually stair-step downward trend. Mm-hmm. So, you could say, well, things aren't quite so bad under, a Republican administration, but they don't get any better either. It's just been a continually stair-step down attack on production and ranchers' property rights in regards to livestock production in the West for the last 100 years.
Gotcha. So, Dr. McIntosh, during your presentation there in Cedar City, you mentioned some of the things, the ideas that you'd come up with to try to help the ranchers and the surprising responses you got from your supervisors. Can you kind of shed some light on that?
Well, yes. When I was working for the Forest Service, and I started to find out that in reality there are congressionally recognized property rights, I would approach one particular boss that I had that I worked for. He'd actually been working for the Forest Service for many years. When I pointed out a particular decision of the Supreme Court, a 1976 U.S. Supreme Court decision, U.S. versus New Mexico that had to deal with water rights, and the fact that the Supreme Court held that the individual ranchers owned the stock water rights in national forests. His response to me was, well, that may be what the Supreme Court says, but we, meaning the Forest Service hierarchy in general, he said, we think the Supreme Court is wrong. We think the government should own everything. And that's kind of the attitude I ran up against when I was working for the Forest Service.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. And you think of the attitude that they take there. You know, I think this is really key for our listeners to understand the origin of property rights. And a lot of times our listenership is generally on the constitutional liberty side, and they understand, you know, that the federal government, you know, has their enumerated authority. But what is less understood is when you talk about how there were actually these good federal laws that codified the philosophy and principles in the Declaration of Independence in relation to property rights. And for the first 100 or so years, maybe a little more, of our country, they actually made laws that were properly authorized under unenumerated power. So this was the federal government doing what they should be doing, right? And actually established good property rights for the ranchers. And so it wasn't like there was this free-for-all and no one knew what to do with lands for 150 years until one day the BLM figured out, hey, we should be managing these lands, right? And someone ought to make some laws and that sort of thing. So there are all these good laws, and now what you just mentioned about the Supreme Court is that the Supreme Court upheld them in the past, saying, yeah, that's right, that's what those laws say. And we know sometimes the Supreme Court opinion is just an opinion. And, you know, just by going by case law, you know, the Supreme Court can't expand its own power. That would make them legislators, which they can't do. But the point is, there is a history of case law. You explained this in your speech as well. A long history of, you called it black letter law. That was the term you used, right?
Yes.
Okay. And it is absolutely black lettered, settled law that these ranchers own their allotments. They own their water rights. They own their mineral rights, or whoever owned it and then sold it. This is ownership, and ownership means full control. And so you want to talk about those laws and to give our listeners that understanding of how this is truly legal for the ranchers to own their land and that sort of thing?
Well, from the beginning, and this may some people are really big on we got to give all the public lands to the state idea, and I was big on that too about 20 years ago until I started doing my research and found that there's a lot of holes in that theory. Number one being that it's always been the intent of Congress to dispose of the public lands, not to keep them, and then
right. And that is Congress's. That is their only power under the Constitution in relation to lands, other than Washington D.C. and the ports thing.
Right. Now, the idea was to dispose of the land, the public lands, to individual homesteaders, individual settlers. It wasn't to just simply take this big chunk of public land and then just hand it over to the state, or then we would just simply be serfs under the state government rather than serfs under the federal government.
Right.
The idea was to make private property owners, and that way the government, whether it be the federal government or the state, would work for the individual citizens. They work for us. And so that was always the intent. But the problem in the West, as the people and settlement progressed towards the western part of the United States, they were moving from an area that was basically a humid, well-watered area into these arid lands in the West. And there was already a system of law in place under the Spanish and Mexican laws, because there were people living in California, New Mexico, southern Arizona, southern Colorado, 100 years before the United States was ever even a country. There were people settled there, and they had this system of laws, what they call the prior appropriation water doctrine. That's where water rights derive from in the western United States. Congress chose to adopt that system. It was well suited to the arid lands in the West. And so we actually have two different land settlement patterns, two different sets of land settlement laws. In the eastern United States, you could make a living on a 160-acre homestead or 320 or 640. But in the West, you could not make a living on that. And so as time progressed, Congress tried to come up with and finally adopted a system of land settlement that fit the needs of the western United States. And that was a split estate system. They did not want to give 160 square miles, which it takes in some places to run a ranch, to be able to support enough livestock for a family to make a living.
Okay, wait, so let's pause right there as you're describing this. So the 160 acres of land. So there was you're under Congress's duty to dispose of lands so that there was private property ownership spread out among the individuals. They did something in the East that they had to do differently in the West, you're saying. And both of them were properly under their enumerated authority dealing with public lands. And so the 160 acres, tell us what the 160 acres was.
Well, that was the homestead. Under the homestead laws, a settler could go out, take up and claim 160 acres, mark out his boundaries, and the moment, by legal definition, the term public lands, that's a big problem with most people nowadays, because they don't understand what the legal definition of the term public land is. Public land is land that is open to entry and settlement, upon which there are no rights or claims. And the very moment the Mormon pioneers went out west and that settler took up and marked out the corners of his homestead, even though no title had yet passed from the federal government to that landowner, that land was now occupied and in the possession of an actual settler. Therefore, it was no longer public land. And there's dozens of court cases on this. The very moment a right of any kind attaches to it, it ceases to be public land.
And that is also very important for everyone to understand. Public land, let that sink in for all our listeners. When you hear them talk about public land on the radio and the newspaper, and environmentalists talk about it, when anyone talks about public land, immediately the conversation is off on a bad tangent, because there's no such thing as public land according to all legal definitions. Right?
That's correct. Even if there isn't we'll take, for example, I'll play both sides of the argument here.
Okay.
But let's say that even if ranchers do not have any property rights, the very moment Congress withdraws an area of land as a military base, an Indian reservation, a forest reserve, it ceases to be public land. It's now no longer open to anyone who wants to go out there and file a claim and claim that land as a homestead. It's been withdrawn. So at the very minimum, a forest reserve, for example, is not public land because it's been withdrawn from settlement and entry. It's been reserved for
right. So we can't call it public land. The people who say, that those dang ranchers, we own that land because we're the public. Right, it's just it's a complete misunderstanding of the idea, how laws have evolved, and what the law even currently means. It's total misnomer.
Right.
So the conversation can't even go anywhere.
There were a lot of issues over this during the settlement of the West. You had Congress making huge land grants to railroad companies. and various things going on. It caused a lot of conflict, but it also enabled the courts to be able to define these issues between competing claimants on land and to be able to develop this huge body of case law that supports all of these various types of claims. For example, a county road in Utah, any county road or state highway in the state of Utah that crosses federal land anywhere is a bona fide right-of-way under some of these particular federal statutes that Congress passed. So if you say, well, that's public land, well, then that means the BLM or the Forest Service can just shut that road off anytime they want. But there's a large body of case law dealing with these type of right-of-ways, and the Supreme Court has said no, that easement belongs to the state, and no federal bureaucrat can just shut it off.
Dr. McIntosh,
So right.
This has been McClintock. We've got to head to a break. We're going to hold you over if that's okay.
This is
Okay.
powerful information, so stay tuned.
This is Ben McClintock and Enoch Moore on the Thursday Liberty Lineup Radio Show on K-Talk Radio. For more information, go to our Facebook page, the Liberty Lineup Radio Show. Like and share. And after the break, we'll be right back with Dr. Angus McIntosh. What really is public lands? What does that mean? What rights are being taken away from the ranchers, and what can we do to protect them? Right back after the break. This is Ben McClintock with Enoch Moore, and you're back on K-Talk Radio AM 630, k-talk.com, with the Liberty Lineup Naked Truth segment where we think right and wrong, not right and left. Join our grassroots network and get our updates and alerts. Just go to libertylineup.com. That's libertylineup.com. Sign up and support the cause of liberty. That's libertylineup.com. You can also like and share our Facebook page, the Liberty Lineup Radio Show. Before we went to the break, we've been speaking with Dr. Angus McIntosh. He is an adjunct professor at Texas A&M University. He was a former Forest Service employee, and he's been going around speaking on the rights of the ranchers. And Enoch, you want to recap?
So we're kind of getting to the meat of what he has to say. What he has to say is so important for everybody, not just ranchers, everybody in this state, everybody in this nation to understand right now. Because people don't understand the nature, the basic argument, like just the basic principles of this land argument. Even no matter which side you're on, there are things we don't understand because people don't know the law. And this is what he's been going around explaining to people. And you can use the information for however you wish, but these are just the facts. And we're getting to the real definition of public land. Okay, this is critical. It means it's open for settlement and there are no prior claims on it. And as soon as something is no longer public, all federal authority over that land ceases to exist. So these are key things we're getting to. We were starting to talk about rights of way and just understanding the real big picture nature of property rights. So Dr. McIntosh, you were talking about before the break the rights of way from the county, and can you continue on with that?
Yes. A lot of people have the misconception that the only way that Congress ever disposed of any interest in public lands was through the various homestead laws, which there were dozens of different homestead laws, the Reclamation Act, Desert Land Act, Stock Raising Homestead Act, but there's over 300 different right-of-way laws that Congress passed. Some of them very important and specifically important to the West because that's the basis of a lot of our county roads and state highways is from an act that was passed in 1866, which was called, some people refer to it as RS 2477. That just simply means Revised Statute 2477. But that's, the Supreme Court has said on several different occasions, that's a basis of our state highways and county road systems in the West. It was what was called a grant in presenti. It was an immediate grant You didn't have to ask for permission from a bureaucrat. You didn't have to have it recorded anywhere. You just had to establish it. And that in itself, Congress and the Supreme Court has affirmed, Congress was intending to make these broad grants. And the same thing with the homesteaders that came out west. They couldn't make a living on 160 acres. What they typically did was take up a 160-acre homestead or a preemption claim or 320 or 640, and then they would graze cattle on the surrounding land, federal land, and establish a range right. And these range rights were recognized under the various state laws. All of the western states adopted their own flavor or type of range code or range laws, and these range rights were recognized in 1875 by an act of Congress, as well as the water rights, what we call water rights throughout the West. Every kind of water right that exists on federal land in the West was recognized under this Act of July 26, 1866. William Rehnquist wrote a really good synopsis of that in 1976 when he wrote the majority opinion in a case called California versus U.S. So this isn't ancient law. This is not well known by the public because most people grew up living in the city. They don't deal with things like range rights or water rights, things like that. Those are primarily rural issues. So even people that grew up in the West, they may have heard peripherally of the term water rights, but not really understand what it is. And it's really a split estate system. What Congress ended up doing is basically adopting a split estate system. They wanted to encourage development of the minerals, but if they gave a rancher title to 160 square miles of land, which is, typical of what one of these western ranches is made up of, then that would prevent miners or oil and gas drillers from going out and developing the minerals. Well, Congress wanted to encourage every type of economic development they could. So in the end, the solution, and it was actually proposed by Teddy Roosevelt in his time period as president, and Congress adopted a series of laws between 1902 and 1916, which basically adopted a split estate system for land disposal. So what ranchers own is a limited service title, a fee title to their allotments, and the government retained the mineral rights. The timber rights were actually granted to the citizens of the state, and this is all in the acts of Congress. This is all in decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. versus New Mexico in 1976 Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court said national forests were established for two purposes: to enhance water yield, to make that water available for private appropriation by the citizens of the state, and to produce timber in order to provide a continuous supply of timber to meet the needs and necessities of the settlers of the arid West. And it's actually a right. If you're a citizen of the state of Utah, you actually have a right to cut timber within a forest reserve for your own personal use, as long as it's not for commercial use.
That is breaking such a sacred cow right there. But this is current settled. This is current actual law, not just settled law, meaning like it took a bunch of people to interpret it. But current actual law is any citizen of the state of Utah can go into a national park and for their own personal use cut down trees and build a house from it.
Well, national forest, not national park.
Sorry, national forest, right?
Right. That's what they were established for.
Right.
To ensure that supply of wood would be available for the use of the citizens. So and I'm not saying that things don't change over time. Maybe the people in Utah might decide at some point, rather than having a right to cut firewood, they'd rather have it locked up as some kind of an endangered species walleye preserve. But until the law is changed, that is the way it is. That's the law. So, it's the same way with these ranchers. Now, they have an actual compensable property right recognized under federal laws as recently as the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976. The National Forest Management Act passed the same year, 1976. That was kind of a landmark year, really, in the way that the federal laws have changed. But both of those acts recognize and grandfather in all of these prior existing rights that the pioneers had developed. And if the general public decides, you know what, John Q. Rancher out there, we want his ranch for whatever it might be. The big thing now is Obama is declaring all of these national monuments that take up millions of acres of land. Well, if that is the will of the people, then that's fine. But you have to pay for property when you take it. Government cannot. That was one of the things the Founding Fathers got into the American Revolution over. The king was just taking private property and not paying for it, and taking it for any use he wanted. And under our Constitution, the Fifth Amendment requires if private property is taken for public use, then they must be paid just compensation. So these pioneer settlers that came out to Utah or anywhere in the West back in 1847 or whenever they showed up, and they were the first settlers there, and they staked their claim, and they established their range rights, and they established all these property rights under the laws that existed at that time. The only way the Congress or any federal bureaucrat can extinguish that property right is by due process and just compensation. So I think that's what most of these ranchers are upset about, is they're having their property taken, property that's maybe been in their family for 150 years, is being taken away from them, and they're not even getting paid any compensation for it.
Yeah, this comes down to the basics of understanding property, and in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal. The very essence of freedom is private property ownership. And so again, for our listeners, let's get down to this basic core principle. If you own something, understanding ownership of property, it's the very definition of what makes America free, and any place free. The Ezra Taft Benson and the Proper Role of Government talked about this. Doctrine and Covenants talks about this. The right and control of property, and it's tied to the principle of free agency itself. When you own something, you truly own it, meaning no one else can exert force on you, or no one else can tell you what to do. That means you can keep it, you can sell it, you can dispose of it, you can choose to use it. It's your decision what happens to that if you own it. So if we're talking about ownership, and all of this goes back to ownership. Federal government cannot take something. It's theft if somebody else owns it. That's just the bottom line. And so a rancher, if they own their allotment, if they own their rights to graze somewhere, if they own their water rights or whatever, if you want to argue that land ought to be conserved in an environmental whatever of some kind, if at a very minimum, if you're not purchasing it, you're stealing it. And that is the core principle here to understand. And so the ranchers today got their property from someone before them. They inherited it, they purchased it, or whatever, and everything goes back to these original claims that were made on originally actual public land, meaning nobody had any claim on it. Now, I'm sure if you, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, I'm sure there are some cases, right, the United States purchased land from Mexico, or they purchased it, or they made a treaty, but ultimately then it became U.S. territory, and then there was public land, except for, you said in many cases people actually owned the land before the United States had it, and so we continued the previous Mexican property laws, right? So
right.
they're
if you go to New
established.
Mexico, there were a lot of land grants down there, but even in areas where they had not yet proved up or acquired the actual legal title from the Mexican government, the fact that those people were in possession of that land, or those Native Americans were in possession of a particular area of land, that the Supreme Court has said removed that land from that classification of public land. And at once there were treaties made and actual boundaries established determining, okay, what is the extent of the actual possession and claim of this particular tribe. Once that was established, then the land outside of those boundaries was technically public land and open to entry and settlement.
Dr. McIntosh, sorry to have to cut you off right there. We're heading off to a hard break. Appreciate it. Everybody can check out these your full presentations online. Where would you like our listeners to go specifically to learn more about what you're doing?
They could go to the Land and Water USA website.
Okay.
And they can learn more about this on that website. I know there are several.
We'll put all the links on our Facebook page as well as on our webpage. Thank you so much, Dr. McIntosh. We hope to have you on again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Special thanks to our segment sponsor and to our show sponsor, Patriot Mobile, where your monthly bill goes to support this show. This has been McClintock and Enoch Moore. We'll be right back with William F. Jasper of the New American Magazine after the break.